Wonderful. Who here has developed a web app or a website using ASP.NET? Amazing. Who has built an Azure backend before? So most of you who raise your hands to start with, by the end of this session, you're going to be able to deploy to Azure without any issues because you're already Azure experts. If you've ever built an ASP.NET website or backend, you know everything you need to know to be an Azure guru. So who is this guy? Well, my name is Mike James. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. I used to be a developer evangelist at Xamarin. I've been at Xamarin for 3 years. But we recently acquired Microsoft in order to get access to their cloud solutions. So it's a little bit of a job title change. Not quite sure what that job actually entails yet. At the moment, it seems lots of meetings and emails, but I'm sure there's more to it than that. I've built a couple of apps. They're on GitHub. Some of them are in the App Store as well. To start with, we've got My Driving. This is a pretty comprehensive application in terms of the Azure side of things. It basically has every single Azure service you could think of thrown into it, even if it makes no sense for that service to actually be included. We built this for the build, so I think it was in April this was released. It uses everything, machine learning. It's got some IoT hub stuff in there as well. It's app service. As I say, pretty much every Azure service you could think of we threw into this application. It's got an iOS, Android, and UWP app for the front end, and it uses the same architecture as Beerdrinking in terms of how we build those client apps, which I'll be talking about in a bit. So if you want to go and have a look at, how do you build a really complex backend and then consume it from mobile, that's a really good example. We've got My Step Counter, which is an app that was built in one morning for iOS and Android. It counts how many steps you take from your device. Really, really simple. Dutch spelling is an app I wrote in order to get better at spelling Dutch words. I actually moved to Belgium 2007, I think it was, for 6 or 7 months. And I didn't want to move there without being able to speak a little bit of the lingo. So I got myself a Dutch tutor because finding a Flemish tutor was almost impossible. So I got myself a Dutch tutor and we would practice twice a week. And I wrote this app in order to improve my spelling. And I ended up moving to Brussels. Does anyone spot the problem with that? It's French. It's French. So it turns out a lot of people in Brussels don't speak Flemish. So we stuck with mostly English and a little bit of French. I can just about order a kebab in French now. I am British, after all. And then last but not least, we've got Hydrate, which is a macOS application. And the reason I mention Hydrate is it's the most unexciting application you've ever seen in your life. We had a customer email us, this was years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and they said, I'm building a Mac application with Xamarin, and it keeps being rejected on the App Store. Does App Store review process actually work for Xamarin apps? And everyone kind of went, we've tested that, right? Turns out no one had actually put an app through the review process for the Mac. So it fell to me to get something quick that we could put through and actually confirm that we could go through the review process. So whilst eating a sandwich one lunchtime, I built this application, and all it does is every hour it sends you a notification telling you to drink some more water. So it's really just a timer with a call to the notification API on OS 10. It went through the review process absolutely no problem, so that was great to see. But I didn't want people downloading it because I was like, it's a really crap app, to be honest. So I did what most mobile developers do to limit their downloads, and I charged for it. So I put the fee at €1 or just over €1, and as a result of that, it now earns me more money than all of my other apps combined. The reason for that is that there hasn't been a race to the bottom for pricing for desktop software. €1 for a desktop app is a bargain. €1 for a mobile app is just greedy developers. So that's worth keeping in mind. So mobile represents the single largest technology innovation of all time. I think we can all agree on that, and we should all be building mobile applications. But most apps are connected apps, and I've no idea who we can attribute this to, but it was probably someone very intelligent. Today I'm going to be talking about how you can build mobile backends with your Xamarin apps, but if you're not using Xamarin, maybe you've built with Cordova. Any Cordova users in? Not one. That's nice. Or you're ashamed. Not sure. Anyone built an app using Objective-C, Swift, Reactive, anything other than Xamarin? Cool. Well, you can still add in Azure. We've probably got some SDKs for you. We certainly do for Objective-C and React and things like Cordova. So although everything you'll see today is mostly focused on Xamarin, just know that it also works if you've got other technologies that you're using. So we're going to look at beer drinking, which is an application that I've been writing for what feels like forever. It's targeting just iOS right now, but it's got an Azure backend. We will be bringing it to Android, potentially UWP in the future. And then we'll look at BATE News, which also has an Azure backend, but it's been designed and implemented in a completely different way to beer drinking, and I open sourced that just yesterday. So once upon a time, I moved to Belgium, as I say, it's around 2007, and I moved for two reasons. Number one, and the top one, was beer. There is a huge amount of beer in Belgium. In fact, this is a Delirium Cafe, and they have over 3,000 different varieties of beer in this one pub. And it's in a basement in the city centre of Brussels. Has anyone been to the Delirium Cafe? It's pretty cool, right? Yeah, but the book, or the menu, I should say, I've given it away, is a book. You ask for the menu, and it's like this thick, and the pages are super thin. It's not, laminated or anything. It's just literally hundreds of pages with just the name of the beer and the price and how large it is. So it's pretty intimidating if you don't know anything about beers. So I downloaded an app that you may have heard of called Untapped. Is anyone using Untapped? Cool. So Untapped is an application built by, I think it's like 3 or 4 guys in the United States. It's built with Cordova, and it looks horrible. It is quite possibly the ugliest app that I've ever had installed on my phone. Really not a big fan of the UI. But the biggest problem I found is because the Delirium Cafe is in a basement and they don't have any Wi-Fi, I couldn't use the app. It required a cellular connection and I just couldn't get it to work. So I'm sat in the pub with this book of 3,000 different beers, and the app that could make me recommendations about what beers I might like isn't going to work. So I was like, I've got to be able to fix this. Another issue I had with Untapped was its technology stack was just so foreign to me. It uses Cordova for the mobile front ends. It's got a LAMP stack with PHP. It uses MySQL for the transactions. It then uses MongoDB for recommendation engines and activities. It uses Redis to store all the counts of how many beers you've had. And then it uses Iron.io for background processing. So it's a pretty foreign stack to me. I wouldn't feel comfortable working on that. So the two big problems is, first of all, it's not native. It's a website pretending to be a mobile app. And secondly, and I'll be honest, when I started this app, the fact that it was on AWS, I didn't really care. I was like, AWS, it's cool. But now I work for Microsoft. Boo! So there's got to be a better way. And that's why I started creating beer drinking. So beer drinking is a traditional iOS application. As I say, we can bring this to Android and UWP with very minimal work due to the way that this has been architected. This is not a Xamarin Forms application. As I say, this is traditional. I'm using a storyboard designer. Now, the reason I've gone traditional is that I really care about the user experience, and it's much easier to create stunning iOS applications when you're doing traditional versus Forms. You can 100% get there with Forms, but you're going to go the long way around, whereas with traditional, you're just kind of shortcutting straight to highly customized apps. So the beer drinking tech stack, Xamarin for iOS. As I say, we'll use Xamarin Android and then UWP. We use Azure App Service for the back end. We use Azure Search for searching, and then we've got a little bit of cognitive services thrown in there as well. The back-end infrastructure, the main reason for App Service was the offline sync, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Azure Search is amazing. I've only got 45 minutes. I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to focus on that, but hopefully a little bit. And then cognitive services. Is anyone using cognitive services? A couple of you. Anyone use Project Oxford? So a few more. Well, Project Oxford is basically cognitive services. Microsoft had a service called Cortana Intelligent Services that started at like 20 grand a month in order to subscribe to that. And then they had Project Oxford, which is part of their research. And they combined the two into this new product offering, which is cognitive services. So it's like 21 different APIs that do various different things. It's a really, really cool set of APIs and well worth checking out. So in the development of beer drinking, I have made some horrible mistakes. The first one being is I started the app with a parse backend. And this allowed me to build a proof of concept really, really quickly. If I'd actually shipped the app using the parse backend, I could have had this shipped last August, which just shows you how much churn I've done on the backend in order to find something that works for me. After parse, I moved on to Convey. Has anyone used Convey? So it's a small company based in Boston, really, really expensive. But they have a .NET SDK as well. But I'll talk about parse first. Anyone using parse? Have you all migrated? Yeah? On AWS or on Azure? Azure, lovely. Managed, or you're doing it all yourself? Managed. Is it still only in the West Coast, or have they moved any more locations? Because they're rolling it out to their different data centers, and when I last checked, it was just in a couple of select, I think, West Coast of the US. So there are some huge, huge pros for why I opted to use parse to start with. The biggest one is that the SDK it's idiot-proof. The .NET SDK is just lovely to use. What else is there? It does push notifications. The user management is incredibly simple as well. If you want to do sign up with email addresses with parse, it's just a couple of lines of code. You can do password resets. Again, all from the SDK. It's all managed for you. It's incredibly simple to do. And then it's got a lovely dashboard as well for managing all of that. And you can go into the dashboard and you can just start to manually edit the data in the tables, and then it's going to be reflected live within your app. But there are some cons to using parse, and the biggest con I found was no offline support. So this whole idea of the app was that I could sit in the basement of Delirium Cafe and use the mobile app. But I couldn't do that with parse. And I started looking at libraries like Akavash, or Afakash, depends how you want to say it. No one's really sure how you say that library name. But it allows you to kind of do an offline situation with some JSON and your web requests. So I plugged that in, and then I could get it working offline on one device, but then when I wanted to sync that to another device, I was creating tables in parse to deal with the syncing and then merging. And I spent more time writing code trying to deal with merge conflicts and syncing between devices than I was writing code about beer. I was like, I'm doing this the wrong way. There's got to be a better solution. It has a bit of a confused pricing model, or at least it did when you could pay for it. Parse was bought by Facebook, and it was basically a free backend for most apps. Very few people were paying for it, which was a part of the problem that Facebook had. And it was difficult to know when you would start paying for it as well. There wasn't a clear point. And so parse was used for a lot of what I like to call throwaway apps. It's kind of apps where you don't see it lasting for very long. You just need it for a couple of weeks, and then you can just kill the back end and kill the app from the App Store. And it's now dead, so that's probably the biggest con for parse. If you do have a parse backend, as I mentioned earlier, you can run it in Azure. You can just do in the marketplace and search for parse, and you can run a managed instance of it, and it will fire up an app service backend. It will give you a MongoDB instance. It deals with all the blob storage, so you can do the image upload. It's pretty nice, but it's a pretty expensive way to run your parse app. I think when I costed it out, it's about $150 a month. And my beer drinking backend is a fraction of that. So it's quite an expensive way to do it, but it means that you can take your existing apps and bring them straight over to Azure. Long term, I'd say you probably want to move away from parse, because who knows how it's going to be maintained. Certainly Facebook aren't going to do that anymore. In fact, Google poached a lot of the parse developers over to Firebase. So I think Firebase is probably going to become the next parse. So anyway, I couldn't use parse because the offline thing, that was horrible. So I moved over to Convey. As I say, Convey is in Boston, and it's very much like parse with a few extra bits and more enterprisey. Convey is really, really focused for enterprise, whereas parse is very much consumer. So again, it does push notifications, user management, and dashboards, but it also does offline sync. But it's got some pretty horrible cons. Yeah. So for what I was looking at in terms of the feature set, I was looking at $24,000 a month. Now, don't get me wrong, Microsoft look after us, but we're not that well paid. So that's a difficult expense to justify. The documentation was poor, and that was a real problem for me. And the .NET SDK was written by a Java developer, so it didn't conform to C# idioms. I've got nothing against Java developers, but they need to uppercase a few bits every now and again to make me feel at home. So when I was using the API, I was like, this just doesn't feel right. And when I was looking at the SDK, a lot of the time the SDK was out of date with the documentation was out of date for the SDK that I was using. And I was getting this for free. I should be very clear here. They were giving me a free subscription to this in order to basically build them the sample app. And even with getting it for free, I decided that this wasn't worth it for a couple of reasons, as I say, mainly the SDK being horrible, but also it would have meant it was almost impossible for anyone to download Beerdrinking from GitHub and deploy their own version, unless you've got a very healthy bank account. So moved away from Convey, and I actually switched over to Mobile Service, which has now been replaced with App Service. Now, App Service is an umbrella term. It's not just, well, it is kind of one thing, but when you think of App Service, you have web apps, mobile apps, API apps, and logic apps. And a lot of people think that these are 4 separate products, but they're not. The product itself is really App Service, and you can think of these individual subsections as more of templates when you're in Visual Studio or the Azure portal. So any one of these can do all of the features of the other. So if I create a mobile app for my app service, I can still put in HTML and use ASP.NET to deliver a website as well. It's just deciding which SDKs and NuGet packages are we going to pull in to the template that we're starting the project with. So when you're trying to decide, do I want an API app or a web app or a mobile app or a logic app, you really can just select on any one of these and then just start adding the features of the bits that you're missing from the others that you want. So don't feel limited when you're picking it, because I think this is probably a big problem that Microsoft has with Azure, is that they've got too many choices. And if you haven't spent a lot of time researching it, it feels a little bit paralyzing. You're like, I don't know which I should click on. But with this, you can just click on any and you'll be good to go. There's a lot of pros to using App Service. I could reuse a lot of my C# code from the client side on the back end. My favorite IDE, Visual Studio. Flexible pricing model. It was really easy to work out how much I was going to spend, and it's also really cheap. The Azure application, the Evolve application that we built for our conference, it serviced, I think, 1.2 million web requests, and it cost us $30 to run for the week. So it's pretty good value for money in terms of the scale that you reach. You can decide to scale up or to scale out. You can run in multiple locations without any issues. It's pretty flexible, so it will grow with you, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. And the marketplace allows you to fill in gaps where Microsoft haven't delivered tooling for you. So if there's a particular service that you want to consume, it's probably within the marketplace already. So you can easily integrate into third-party stuff. Some cons. It required more time on the back end. When I built Beerdrinking, I didn't want to become a back-end developer. I didn't want to have to write any back-end code. But using App Service, I had to do that. There was no way of getting away from it. I had to migrate from Mobile Service over to App Service, which, I'll be frank, wasn't the easiest of migrations to make. I obviously wasn't working for Microsoft at the time, so I didn't have any resources to help me outside of just looking on Stack Overflow. But there's still parts of the Mobile Service to App Service migration that haven't successfully migrated over for me, and I'm still in the process of fixing. So that hasn't been ideal. And followed up by the fact that we're now about to have to move over to .NET Core. That's another migration. So I'd say the churn is pretty high on this right now. What I've been promised, and I do believe the guys on this, is that the migration to .NET Core is just going to be a button click, and it's going to do it all for us, because there's not that much of a change. So there's a bit of hope on that one. So on the back end, we're doing authentication, and then we've got some tables full of the data. So we've got peers, check-ins, reviews, and users, as well as some secret source. The secret source isn't that secret because it's all open source on GitHub. So I'll tell you what it is. I'm tracking your location in a bit of a creepy way. What I'm doing is that every check-in, I take your location, and then I go and look at the weather conditions for where you are, and then I save that into the tables as well. So that when we're feeding into the recommendation engine, which is using cognitive services, I was originally going to use machine learning, but there's now a service I can just call into. With the recommendation engine, I can pass in the weather data about right now. So when you say, hey, recommend me a beer, I can have a look through your history and decide that on a hot day, you really love lagers, but on a cold day, you do love a double. If today's quite cold, we'll recommend a double to you. So trying to collect as much information about you as humanly possible to store in the database to try and make the machine learning side of things a little bit more interesting. So if you like big data, this could be quite a fun project for you to get involved in. You don't just have to use App Service as well. I do want to briefly mention Azure Functions. Has anyone looked at Azure Functions? 3 of you. Azure Functions is amazing. So Azure Functions is basically serverless. You don't have to set your scaling rules or anything like that. You just use Monaco, which is the C# editor in a browser. And you write your C# in the browser, you hit save, and it's now available to any service to use. So it just becomes a REST endpoint. You can call into it. And if you've got 1 billion people all at once call that one endpoint, Microsoft will automatically scale out and scale up to the size that's required in order to fulfill that request. So you don't have to define any rules. It's always on by default. It uses something called dynamic compute, so it's just going to grow and shrink to whatever the requirements are for that very moment that it's running. And you're only charged by bandwidth and CPU time, so it's actually a really cheap way to run code. I think that this is probably what you want to replace web jobs with. If you've got any web job roles, you probably want to bring this over to Azure Functions. It's super early days for it, but it's turning out to be quite a nice little feature of Azure, well worth checking out. As I say, if there's some C# code that you need to run, maybe you're using soft delete in your SQL database, and every week you want to go through and just actually hard delete all those soft deletes, you could use an Azure function for that. Very self-contained, modular little bits of code that you want to call into, rather than scaffolding out this huge ASP.NET backend. You just write the bits that you care about. So I want to show you a demo. First of all, we'll go through the client side. We'll have a look at how I've architected the application, and then we'll have a quick look at the back end, and then we'll move on to BATE news. So I'll share my screen with you. So I want to apologize about the state of how beer drinking looks right now. I'm in the process of creating a dark theme, because the rumors are pretty strong that iOS is going to get a dark theme. So I feel like I should probably, at least have that as an option within the settings. So I'm in the process of making a dark theme. So the app has never looked uglier. If you're interested to see how it really looks, I share all of the stuff on GitHub so you can grab the sketch file. But I also have links open to the Zeppelin. Is anyone using Zeppelin? It's amazing. I'll show it to you. For those of you who don't know, I do my design in Sketch, which is like Illustrator, but for Mac, and it's amazing, idiot-proof. So I design my application, and then I export it to Zeppelin, and I can come in and I can put notes on this so that I can say that, when you tap on a star, it sets a star rating. And this is how beer drinking will look when it's dark. I'm in the process. This view is almost finished. But then you can go through all your other views as well. James Montemagno in the users. Sad panda, no internet connection. So it allows the designers to create their designs and share them with the developers, and then developers can come in and they can grab the artwork. So I can see what colors this is, I can see the spacing. So this is really useful for when I'm doing the auto layouts, because I can just come in here, hover over the control, see what the constraints I need to make are. So it massively speeds up going from design to actually implementing this. So I'm a huge fan of Zeppelin, well worth checking out. But all of this is shared, so if you want to have a play with what I've been doing, you can, as I say, just go onto GitHub and you can start implementing some of these views if you want as well. So here is the project, and it's a little bit small, so we'll zoom in. Now, I have beer drinking iOS, and then I have the client SDKs library. Now, the client SDKs library is probably going to be a bit intimidating to you, because there's a lot of libraries. And the reason there's a lot of libraries is because I've churned so much on the back end. I'm now effectively on my 4th back end. If we go Parse, Convey, mobile service, app service, There's only so many times that you can rewrite a view model that's, really bound to your backend. So I've gone very modular, and it's actually working quite well for me. So I have a lot of libraries, but the key one is Beerdrinking Core. Beerdrinking Core has my view models that then depend on all of the other services and data stores. So I've got very clear separation of concerns. I have libraries just for my interfaces, for particular features, and then I go ahead and implement them for whatever backend I'm using. I could just as easily replace Azure with AWS without having to affect any of my client code. My iOS app doesn't care what backend it's running on. I would just need to come into these SDK folders and replace the beerdrinking.service.azure with the beerdrinking.service.aws. So to show you this, I'll show you the search feature, because this is using Azure Search. The reason I chose Azure Search is that off by one spelling mistakes with BreweryDB, which is where I'm getting this data from, just yields no results. So if I spell Duvel as Davel, don't know why I would do that, but if I did that, it's just off by one, BreweryDB would return 0 results, and that would be a pretty poor user experience. So Azure Search fixes that. It knows about 50 different languages. It knows that shoes are also footwear. So even if they're not searching for exactly what you've got indexed within your database, Azure Search can be intelligent enough to still show the results that would be applicable to them. You can do things like term boosting as well. So at some point in the future, I want to monetize beer drinking for the community to do bug bounties. And I want you to be able to order beers through the application. Well, if I've got a particular set of beer that's in stock and it's been sat around for a bit too long, I can use term boosting, and I can boost results in order to show you the beers that I actually want you to see. So make sure that they end up in the results. I can also do proximity searching as well. So if you're looking for bars in the area, I can use Azure Search in order to show you the bars within a particular location. So it's got a lot of really neat features. Within beer drinking, I'm doing it pretty simply. I'm using the Suggestions API. We'll search for Castile. Now, I haven't got my backend on set to always on. So what this is going to do is it's going to call up, and that's going to start the backend working. Because this isn't released into the App Store yet, it doesn't need to be always on. So that first search always takes a little bit longer as Azure is spinning up a VM for me. So you could see as I was typing, maybe you couldn't see that, as I type, it's actually giving me suggestions, which is what you would expect when you're using things like Bing, whoever uses Bing, or Google. You can tell I work for Microsoft now, can't you? It just slips in. So we've got the search suggestions, which is another way to stop people having spelling mistakes and off by one errors, because they no longer have to type in the full search term that they're looking for. And again, this is just provided to me within the Azure.NET SDK. To show you the code that's actually executing this, I use a service locator to call into all of my services, be it my logger, pulling up data from my Datastore, or using REST APIs to call into things like Azure Search. You'll see I have this iSearch service, and I use the service locator to resolve the search service. The service locator allows me to swap out implementations really, really quickly. So if I want to play around with an AWS version, that'd be really easy for me to do. I just implement the interface with AWS, whack it into the service locator, and it will just work. Big fan of the service locator. It does make it a little bit more difficult to find where things are actually implemented. You kind of have to know the layout of the project. But you'll see that when I have I have a method, search, I pass in a search term, and then we fire off into the search service.search. So I'll show you the abstraction for that. It's a service, so it's going to be under beerdrinking.service.abstractions. Very simple. Let's see where I've implemented this. Boom. There we go. So I'm calling into Azure, and I'm invoking just an API within my Azure backend. So it's not doing very much exciting within the mobile app, but as I say, I can easily replace my search provider with another if I need to without having to change my iOS application. So let's have a look at the back end to see what code is actually, what's happening in my API controller to allow this to work. Now, I'm not getting it wrong, it just asked me 3 times, because why not? So this is my backend. Again, this is all on GitHub. So if you want to go and have a look at this more in depth, feel free to download it and to fork it or create branches and add features if you want. I'm not precious about this. It's all under MIT as well. So if you wanted, you could beat me and get it into the App Store. But I would probably be a bit angry. So you see we inherit from the API controller because we're just going to have this as a REST endpoint. And I have the get method. And I pass in my search term. The reason I've got queryable expand attribute is what I'm saying is that when I query, and it's got a complex object, so it's got nested objects such as brewery or images, which in turn have their properties, I want to always pass back those objects as well. I don't want that to ever come back as null if we've got it in the database. So just by using that attribute, I don't have to inflate that myself. It will just do it for me, which is pretty neat. But I'm now within this method, I'm using the Azure Search .NET SDK in order to use the suggestion API in order to get a list of suggested beers from the search term, and then I return that down to the mobile app. Now this code was originally written for iOS, or Xamarin iOS naturally, but I decided to move it up into the cloud so that anybody could call it rather than it being done on the device. Because why do it on the device when you can do it in the cloud? So very, very, very simple stuff for the search, but you kind of get an idea for building just a standard ASP.NET backend. We've also got table controllers, so if we pull up the Solution Explorer, we'll go to beer controller. And this is a table controller of the type beer. So I've got all my standard CRUD operations, so I can get all the beers, I can update beers. And because I'm using the table controllers, it will work offline as well from the mobile apps. So if we have a look at the data stores, datastore.azure, you'll see I have a beer store. Now it's pretty minimal coding because most of it's happening in the base class, in the base store. And the base store deals with the implementation for the CRUD operations, so get and setting, updating, and patching, and everything that you would need to do for your CRUD operations for the SQL side of things. And as I say, this all just works offline through using the Azure SDKs and using the tables on the back end. So it's all very simple, but we've made it even simpler. So I want to show you BATE News. So BATE News is an application that I wrote because I've been working on beer drinking. I normally get 2 or 3 hours a week to play around with it. And by the following week, I realized that I need to rewrite what I wrote last week or swap out the back end again. So BATE News was a little app, and I've got a few of these on the go that I come to when I just need to switch off from beer drinking and write some code that isn't about beer and isn't that much of a complicated social network of an app that also does machine learning and various other things. Something a bit simpler. So does anyone here know of the tabloid newspaper in Britain, the Daily Mail? Anyone read it? One? Okay. So the Daily Mail is an interesting newspaper. They certainly have an interesting political view of the world. It's not one that I agree with. So I've built this app because some of the headlines that they write, they fall more into humor than they do reality. And I read some Daily Mail headlines and it makes me genuinely laugh. So I thought it would be quite fun to see, is it easy to spot a Daily Mail headline versus a headline from The Onion? It turns out it's quite difficult to spot them. So the app is a Tinder-style application built entirely in C#. There is a popular Objective-C component that's within the Xamarin Component store for doing this Tinder-style animation. That didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. It was very, very easy to get started with, but I wanted to be able to ask the view controller to give me the currently displayed headline. Or grab a headline from an index. It wouldn't allow me to do that, so I built this entirely in C#, so I built the custom control from scratch. So it's pretty easy. The headline appears, you decide if it's real or fake. This one says, woman 63 becomes pregnant in mouth with baby squid after eating calamari. Show of hands for that's a real headline? No one thinks that's a real headline. That's a real headline. Daily Mail. Gotta love it. So, Daily Mail or The Onion, you decide. Most of them are true, and when I say true, I don't mean that I fact-checked that this woman became pregnant in the mouth, but this is a genuine headline from the Daily Mail. So this uses Azure App Service, but it's not using an ASP.NET backend. When you create an app service backend in the Azure portal, by default, it's going to be a Node.js backend. It's not until you deploy your ASP.NET backend that it becomes a C# backend. So I'm using Easy Tables with App Service, and Easy Tables are a really, really, really simple way to build a mobile backend for something simple like this app. I need to store a list of headlines that are accessible to numerous devices, and I want to be able to update those headlines without having to ship a new version of the app. Let's say the Daily Mail get in touch and they say, actually, we've taken that article down, or they get in touch and sue me and I need to take the whole thing down. I will need to be able to change the headlines pretty quickly. So App Service allows me to do that. I didn't want to have to write an ASP.NET backend, but I still wanted to be able to use the same SDK on the client side and my experience from having built apps that connect to the full ASP.NET backend. So it's crazy easy to get started with. What I actually did for this is I created an Excel spreadsheet of headlines. I went through their website and through The Onion, and also went through Not The Onion, which is a subreddit, and I found some of the best ones, and I added them to my Excel spreadsheet. I exported it as a CSV file, and I uploaded it to Azure, and it built me the SQL table for me, and allowed me access. So the whole process of going into the Azure portal and creating a new app backend from start to finish with data in there took about 5 minutes. And most of that was waiting for the SQL Server to provision, which I now moan about if it takes 5 minutes, but really, provisioning a SQL Server in 5 minutes is crazy fast. So it's extremely scalable. So just like with beer drinking, if this app becomes popular and I've got 1 million people querying it at once, it will just scale in order to meet that demand. And it has offline synchronization as well. Because it's using the same SDKs as if I'd used an ASP.NET backend, this all just works offline as we would expect. There is one big con. If you're trying to do relational data, this is not the approach that you want to be building your applications. If the data that you're storing is very siloed and doesn't really relate to each other, then this is a perfect way to build your apps. So I just want to show this to you and show you how I went about building it. So first of all, let's have a look at the app running on the iOS simulator. And I should say, this is on GitHub. I open sourced it yesterday. It's also in the App Store if you want to download it and have a play with it. It's free to download. So today's headlines can read like the ramblings of a mentalist. Can you spot the difference? So we're going to, there we go, sync the data down from Azure. You can't quite see it up here, but if you, on the screen behind you, you can just about make out the cards. It's a very thin border. It's about a pixel. So it's probably being lost on the projector. But there's also, when you see it on the device, there's a really nice animation that when the card comes off to the side and is no longer visible, we pop the other two cards up for it to come back in behind. That was quite fun to work on. So this headline is Swedish Health Minister, loud sex is healthy. Do we think that's a real headline or a fake headline? For real? A few of you? For fake? Okay, there's some undecided. We can just click on the glasses, and it's going to take us to an SS Safari view controller, and we can see if it's real just by looking at the URL. This looks like a real article. Huh. We can swipe that off to the side. Women make the best spies because they can combine sympathy with a ruthless streak, says former chief of MI5. That to me sounds like Daily Mail. Should we have a look? There we go, dailymail.co.uk. It's a goldmine for good headlines. Yeah, it's very interesting. So that's the application. It's pretty simple, but right now, the version that's on my Mac is actually getting the data from just an observable collection that we populate when we launch the app. So let's make this offline and make it work with Azure. So I will load up the project, BATE News. As I say, this is all on GitHub. You can grab this. This app is using a library that myself and Piers Bogan have created called the App Service Helper Library. I found a lot of the code I was writing with Beerdrinking, with My Driving, and all of the other Azure apps that I've been building since Christmas, they all have basically the same code in them. They have the same classes that I'm copying and pasting over and just renaming the namespace. I was like, well, why don't I turn this into a reusable component? And then we started to think about how we could make it do some more interesting things. So we've brought down the total number of lines of code that I write on average per table from 100 lines of code for those CRUD operations. We can bring the whole thing down to getting it initialized and good to go within 4 lines of code. If we want to have something brand new, which is a connected observable collection, which is an observable collection which when you add or remove an item, will send that off to Azure. That's just 5 lines of code from start to finish. So we're going to do that. We're going to create a connected observable collection. You can see here I already have an observable collection of type headline. We're going to turn that into a connected observable collection. We're going to set up the app service helper library, and then we're going to run the app and see that it actually works. So first things first, let's make this connected. And we no longer need the system.collections.object model namespace. It's useless to us, so let's get rid of that. Now we need to create a client. And we'll initialize it. And when we initialize it, we pass in the URL for our endpoint. So this is something you can grab from the Azure portal. In this case, I always store it in a helper file. And then we want to register a table. Now, the registering of a table is just registering the table that we'd have on the back end. So in this case, it's headlines. In Beerdrinking, I'd register a table for beers, for users, for reviews, for photos, for locations. But in this case, because I'm only just doing headlines, I only need to register the one table. And then I go ahead and finalize the schema. So that's the 4 lines of code. I could write a bit more code and get this to work with just that 4 lines of initialization, because we can call in and get the table, so client.table for headlines. But I want to use that connected observable collection. So why don't we set that? So what have I called it? Headlines equals new connected observable collection, headline. And then we'll do client.table. And we can go ahead and get rid of that. And we can get rid of that as well. So that's all I need to do. Those 5 lines of code have now made this work with Azure. And we'll get it running so you can see that it's fetching the data. And whilst it's deploying, we'll pop over to the Azure portal. And we'll go to my resource groups. And we'll go to Dank News. Daily Mail actually use Azure, so I couldn't register Daily Mail. I also couldn't register Daily Fail, because it seems that they've taken that as well. What's interesting about the Daily Fail is it looks like they're using it for their testing. So it's kind of, I think that's quite a good name for their testing team to have come up with. So we're launching the app, and there we go. It's gone ahead, connected to Azure. It's downloaded the data. Blimey, I hope there's no Tinder users. Big-headed babies more prone to cancer. That can't be real, surely. Oh, God, that was real. So you get the idea, very simple. But if we have a look at the Dank News app service, we'll see it's not hugely popular right now. But the important thing is this easy tables. Now, easy tables is that thing where I can just upload a spreadsheet and it's going to build the database for me. It's really, really easy to get started. If you're building an app today that has a local SQL database, there really isn't a reason not to be using Azure with easy tables if you want to just get something shipped quickly. I was at a hackathon in Athens, and a guy was using a SQLite database, and he was doing what I did earlier, which is populate. When the app starts, we'll run through this method and we'll populate the database full of some data. I was like, that's a crazy way of doing it. Crazy way. Let's just whack it all into easy tables. It's going to be 4 lines of code. We'll be good to go. He loved me for that. It was great. So we have the table, and we can add new tables. And as I say, we can import from CSV as well. And you can see it's added all of the items that I had within my spreadsheet. So you can see all of the the headlines that I've got. And what I'll be doing in the coming weeks is creating an Azure function, which I fire off every day to go off to the Daily Mail website and to look for keywords. I'll look for things like cancer and immigrants, because those are the key buzzwords that the Daily Mail likes to throw around. So any headlines that have that, I'll just pull them into the database for people to decide if that's real or not. I'll also then go and query Not the Onion to go and find some other humorous headlines, as well as querying the Onion for some fake headlines that are quite amusing. So as I say, this app in total, development time on the back end really is just 5 minutes worth of development. You can see just how quickly I got it working with the App Service library. I did that yesterday, and it was even quicker because I wasn't having to explain to anyone the actual process of doing it. Who here has MSDN? Amazing. So you've all got Azure credits. Who is using their Azure credits? So there's a few hands that didn't go up. So you're basically throwing away money every month that Microsoft gives you to use on these services. There's no reason not to just spin up an instance of this stuff and just have a play with it. Even if you're not going to ship a production-ready app, if you've got an app idea, you can get it connected to a scalable backend in no more than 5 minutes, and it won't cost you a penny. So it's well worth having a play with if that's something of interest to you. Whilst we're in the portal, I'll quickly show you how you can create a new instance of this stuff. We won't actually wait for it to happen, because as I say, the provisioning of the database normally takes around 5 minutes. Which, as I say, is normally quite quick, because most people would take like a week to get a new SQL Server online. So I moan about 5 minutes, but really, it's better than watching me up here for a week. That would be tiresome for everyone. So we'll do web and mobile, but we could also search. And again, this is that whole, what do I want, a web app, a logic app, a mobile app, what do I want? And you're just unsure about it, you can really just pick anything, as long as it's part of that app service umbrella. You wouldn't want to pick function app, because although function app kind of runs on top of the app service, it's a bit more complex, so you don't want to do that. I took this today, thank you, Mark. Oh no, we don't want to do that. I like how Chrome just completely ignores any messages that we have. Do not disturb, and Chrome's like, this is important. We'll do a mobile app. But as I say, we could choose a web app as well. Bum, 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 bum. We hit create. It's going to ask us for the name. We'll say, hello world. Amazing. It's got to be unique, you see, so you've just got to try and... There we go, that's good. We can create a resource group. A resource group is like a folder of services. So I always create a new resource group for every distinct app that I'm creating. So Beerdrinking has one resource group with loads and loads of services within it. All my to-do samples, I throw in a to-do 3, to-do 4 resource group and just keep iterating the numbers, or incrementing the numbers. And then at the end of the demo, I can just go ahead and delete all of the resource groups, and that's going to get rid of all the sub-projects. So it's a good way of keeping things separate and easily being able to manage them. Blah, blah, blah. We hit create, and that's going to start creating our app service. And then all that you would need to do is go into the app service, select that easy table, upload your CSV file, and boom, you've got a SQL database ready to be able to query, add data to. You can do authentication as well with just one line of code. Alternatively, you can then go into Visual Studio and upload a full ASP.NET backend. Let's say I've numerous samples on both approaches. I've got samples such as Beerdrinking that use the ASP.NET backend using mobile apps. It's architected with the best practices. It's always difficult to find what the best practices are because a lot of people aren't willing to commit to what a best practice actually is. But I think we're pretty much there. We spent a long time with the Microsoft team to try and make sure that we get this right. In terms of the client side, it's very, very modular. So you should be able to reuse a lot of the libraries that I've built for any mobile connected apps that you're building. If you're building simpler apps, such as BATE News, you also have the App Service helper library, which takes, as I say, hundreds of lines of code down to 4 or 5, depending on what you want to do. And you've also got easy tables that make the process of maintaining and deploying a backend incredibly simple. I think that may have already done. There we go. It's already done it. That's wonderful. We'll come into our resource group, blah, blah, blah. And then we come into, here we go, easy tables. And then we can upload our spreadsheet, and we've then got our backend already created for us. So that's just how quick and easy it is. As I say, 4 or 5 lines of code, and we can be querying the data here, and it works offline as well. So I can go into the pub, into the Delirium Cafe to get really, really drunk, and I can sit there playing with headlines all evening without any issues. So it's pretty cool, or at least I think it is. So you can find everything that you've seen today on GitHub. It's all open source. BATE News is in the App Store if you want to download it. Feel free. I always do like reviews. I don't build Android apps, so apologies if there's anyone here that's an Android user and wants to play with any of this. Android is a beautiful disaster of an operating system, so I like to stick with iOS. I'm sure Monte Magno will port some of this stuff to Android at some point. So you can grab everything from GitHub, the back ends, the front ends. Any questions? No questions. I must have done an amazing job, or you're really bored. Sorry? I won't throw the box if there's any questions. No questions at all? Perfect. Well, I look forward to... Oh. Okay. So I requested an Untapped API key, and I don't know why they didn't give me one. Yeah, I've looked at the Untapped API. Their database certainly has a lot more data than BreweryDB. But I don't think I want to use their database because they've got pretty strict rules on it. So you have to delete the content every 24 hours. From your database. So if you're doing caching, you can only have your cache live for 24 hours, which makes offline sync really difficult. Because if that's a rule, then I'm going to have to do it on client side as well. So you think you've downloaded your beer database for offline, and the day later I've got to delete it. So it seems like a lot of engineering to get to a point, to cut that. I looked at Rate Beer as well. Rate Beer is another database service. They no longer give out APIs. At all. You can't even request them. But what they do have is pretty poor security. So I have been able to get access to bits of their data that are quite useful. So for example, BreweryDB, which is the service that I use, and that's just passing me JSON about the beer. It's pretty basic information. It doesn't contain any UPCs, which is a unique product code for when you're doing barcode scanning. And I remember I went to Belgium with the app working, and I was pretty pleased with it, and I showed it to my Belgian friend. He was like, how do I scan a barcode? And I was like, oh, just forget about all of the amazing things I've implemented and go for the one thing I haven't, And he's like, yeah, but it has to do barcode scanning. I was like, yeah, but my database doesn't have barcodes. Like, it's going to be a real pain to get that data. He's like, well, this app does it. And he showed me the really ugly Rate Beer app. And I was like, okay, well, let me sniff what this is actually doing. The API is open for that. So what I'm doing for the barcodes, and if you look at my backend, in fact, you can go to this is running locally, but I use Swagger, and you can get to this on the public version as well. So you go to the URL for my backend, which is in GitHub, type in Swagger, and then you can see barcode. So I can get and post a barcode. And when I put in the UPC of the beer, it will then go off to the Rate Beer endpoint with that UPC. It will parse the result back, which is not got an ID that I can look up in my database. So I take the string of the name, search for that within the suggestions, and then return the suggested beers based on the string name. So it's a bit of a hack to get it, but it works for the moment, all the time that my database doesn't have any UPC data. But what I'm doing as part of the check-in process is that when you check a beer in, if it was done on a bottle, and again, I'm checking, are you drinking this from tap or from bottle, in order to help that machine learning make the recommendations. When you check in via bottle, we'll ask you to scan the barcode so that we can build a database full of beer barcodes as well. So there's lots of little things like that. But yeah, I wanted to use Untapped to start with, but it's just locked down. And actually, The Untapped API only really works if you're building an Untapped clone, and that's not what I'm going for. I'm going for really rock-solid recommendations for beers and less of the social side of things. But I really do want some good recommendations on beers, and I'd rather take a recommendation from a computer than a friend, because at least a computer can do some, hardcore maths on me to work out what I'd like. Any other questions?
Yeah. About can you use the box or repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question.
Well, it's a bit of a complicated question, maybe. About the search service, if you read the documentation, it always suggests that you are indexing something.
Yes.
But actually, it stores a lot of things. So, how far is search being a database in itself? So, do you need to have some backup for your data, or can you just store anything in search?
Yeah, so Azure Search uses its own index. So you can point it to your SQL table, and it will index that for you. Now, the basic version of Azure Search is limited to 10,000 items in your index. So that's effectively 10,000 lines in your database. Beerdrinking has 60,000 beers in the database, so basic didn't work for me, so I had to go for the one up, which works out at like $25 a month.
Why do you need then the extra database storing your beers? Why can't you just store everything in search and be done with it?
The extra database is created so that we can define the index, because actually the data I've got within my search index isn't the same data that I've got within my database. I keep the IDs for the beer, and I keep the beer name and the brewery. I don't need any more information, because if I was indexing based on search terms in the beer description, we would get a lot of false positives. So you're just searching for beer names, so that's the only part of the index I want, which minimizes the packet that I'm sending back down to the device. Now, you can manage the index in two ways. You can do it manually, so you can deal with CRUD, so updating, deleting, adding beers into the index when you need to, which is the way you should do it, because your search index will always be up to date. The alternative is to point a crawler to your SQL table, but there's no defined schedule for it. So it's just going to run whenever it wants.
What is the downside to just putting every field you have into search? And then
When you do the search query, it's got to look through more fields, and the packets that it's going to return, so the object, the JSON that's returning, has all of those fields in it. So you're bloating up a return, and if you're doing suggestions, you want your suggested packets, your return data, to be as small as possible, because actually most apps, when you're doing suggestions, are just going to show you the name. So yeah, you absolutely can, if you want, index.
problem if you address the search directly from your app. So if you do it from the backend itself.
If I do it from the backend, it's pretty minimal. But again, I'm not sure there's a benefit. You should to me, you should keep the two separate things separate. You've got your database of beers, and then you've got a search index. Now, you won't always want those to be exactly mirrored. There are going to be times when you want them to be separate, and there's going to be times when you don't want to return certain data that you're playing around with.
Or maybe the data in search is much more expensive to store.
Oh, it's free. Well, you pay for the search service, and then you have the amount of data you want to store. So the 10,000 items. It doesn't matter how big those items are. They could be Word documents, they can be web pages, they can be PDFs, they can be JSON, they can be whatever you want. So they could be absolutely massive. You could store 50 gigs worth of data within the Azure Search index if you wanted to, and you wouldn't pay any extra as if you're using Beerdrinking, which has got 60,000 items, but the whole search index comes in at like 18 megs. So, yeah. Azure Search is amazing. I absolutely love it. And I found it because I was trying to find a solution to solving the off-by-one problem. And that's fairly simple to do off-by-ones. And I could create a link statement to look through my beer database, and if it's out by 1 or 2, still have it as a possible result. But straight up spelling mistakes, where they were just completely off, were impossible to deal with, and the suggestions were getting more and more complex. And I was reading PhD papers from people that work at Google on how they've implemented some of this stuff, and I was like, phew. And I found myself back in the past situation where I'm looking at code that I don't care about. I'm not passionate about search, really. I'm passionate about building a beer app, and now I'm having to work out how to build machine learning to do, suggested search results. whereas this is just a service I can pay for. And it's built on technology from Bing, which although most of us don't use, it's actually a pretty good search engine. And it's also built on technologies from the Office team as well. So it really has a good grasp of language, which is something because I also try to use webspellcheck.net, and I would put in my search results, and again with Duvel, it would come back with duvet, which is close, and most people would probably misspell duvet as Duvel, but it had no concept of product name, so I really needed to be able to manage that. The other option was Elasticsearch, but Azure Search is built on top of Elasticsearch. It just gets rid of the complexities of it for me and gives me a really, really nice .NET SDK. So yeah, I'm a huge, huge fan of Azure Search now.
So what's it cost? Do you know that to buy hard?
Yeah, so it's free for 10,000 rows. You can go up to 1 million rows for, I'm going to give it to you in pounds, so that's probably not that useful now, because like, yeah, if any, yeah, it's still free. Brilliant. So for pounds, for the next tier up, you're looking at £25 for 1 million documents, and then you can get to 10 million documents for like £150 a month. But with the 10 million documents one, you're also able to scale out to like 10 different instances of it running at once. So you have a lot of room to grow. With the £25, I can scale out to 3 instances. But this isn't slow. This is actually one of the fastest bits. And what I also like about it running as a separate service is when I inevitably break my backend, which happens quite a lot. Now, I should say I'm using deployment slots, so that doesn't cause me any production issues. But when I break my backend, I can still call into the search and know that it's still going to work because it's not relying on me breaking my SQL database. It's completely unrelated. So I really like that.
Searching on misspelled words, would you still use search or use something like DocumentDB?
I would still use search because of the filtering. When you get into the filter stuff, you can do some really cool stuff as well. And the fact that it understands more about the language. So as I mentioned before, it knows that footwear is shoes, eyewear, glasses. So you don't have to be searching for exact terms. It understands enough about the languages, and it supports 50 different languages. So Microsoft are some really, really clever engineers, and I'd rather, outsource the search part of my...
Yeah, sure, but you're using some language-intensive kind of application. I need to have a big, big database of really small orders, and then to be able to search through those based on some fields.
Yep.
I'm wondering whether search would be the...
Well, if you've got less than 1 million items in your database, then it's $25 a month. So it's not a huge expense. But at the same time, if it's not that text heavy in terms of the data that you're going to index, you should probably just use a link query, because you'll probably get similar results if you don't have that much data to index. Yep.
I think we should wrap it up. But thank you, James.
Thank you.